is a pernicious lie that's going around and been going around for quite a while. And it is that America is based on genocide. Genocide of the Native Americans, of the American Indians, of the indigenous peoples of the continental United States. This lie has been told by the Russians over and over, by Putin himself, and by their proxies. And many of those proxies are Catholics, or people who say that they're Catholics. So let me tell you right now that to say that America is based on genocide is a lie. It is a lie. And I'm going to present to you evidence and principles today that show you why it is a lie. Now, a lot of what I present here today comes from my forthcoming book, The American World Order, All Things According to God's Law. Americans always cooperated with God and with creation. We made things, we grew things, we mined things, we built things, we invented things, we figured out ways to give people work, to spread the goods around the country, to increase wealth. These are all the things that are part of civilization. And when we came to North America, and as we settled North America, we saw a lot of the land was simply, a lot of the resources in the land was simply not being used. And it was inhabited by Indians, the American Indians, the Native Americans, indigenous people. And they had a different way of life from ours. And it was certainly not as civilized as ours, and some would say it wasn't civilized at all. And some would say, and the theorists use this term, to say that people who are not as civilized as other people in the world, that is, people who are not civilized, can be considered backwards people. It's not meant to be derogatory, it's meant to be explanatory. Because what I'm going to talk to you about are a couple of very important principles. And one of those principles is something called providential destination. And this idea says that a people or a state better able to develop the resources of an area can and should develop those resources. Now, in order to get into this idea of providential destination, which is about making the earth fruitful and cooperating in creation and spreading these goods around the world, which is very Christian, very Catholic, I'm going to turn to one of my favorite authors, John Epstein. John Epstein authored, edited Code of International Ethics, as I told you, which came out in 1952-1953 under the Malines Group or Mechelin Group. It had the Neil Obstat imprimatur of the Bishop of Baltimore, I believe. So in paragraph 100, he explains this idea of providential destination and ultimately this interplay between a backwards people and a civilized people, which explains the interplay between the American Indians and the Americans. So let's go. From paragraph 100, quote, attempts have been made to discover titles of more universal application capable of justifying in all circumstances the subjection of backwards peoples. This has led theorists to put forward the idea of the providential destination of the world's resources and of the civilizing mission of colonization. Paragraph 101. The Creator, who has shared out the riches of the world between the various parts and peoples of the globe, has nevertheless given them for the use of all men. The plan of divine providence must be respected, and the various human groups have no right to consider themselves as the sole beneficiaries of the wealth and advantages of the territory they occupy. Thence it follows that an harmonious and fruitful division of labor must be established between the nations in order to place at the disposal of all the members of the human community the resources of each part of the world. The divine plan is distorted, and humanity is frustrated of its due when backwards nations, through incapacity, slackness, or laziness, fail to develop the potentialities of their territories. As long as there is no authority whose task it is to remedy this disorder, any state, provided it has the means and the will, may undertake this mission and can withdraw, if necessary, from the native sovereignty the rights which it has proved itself incapable of exercising for the common advantage of all nations. End of quote. This is the concept of providential destination, meaning that if you have a backwards people or nation which isn't fully developed in civilization, and it is unable or unwilling to develop the goods in its territory, another state, a civilization, a civilized state, a civilized people may move in and develop that property and may serve to colonize, if you will, that territory and that backward nation. Another title that Epstein's book deals with, and which goes all the way back to the School of Salamanca, as does this concept of providential destination. Another title that goes back is the civilizing of backwards people. And we're going to discuss that briefly today. The Indians were a backward nation or people, and I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean that in the sense of analyzing who and what they are. Theorists use this term for a number of different people. I submit to you that through incapacity, slackness, or laziness, they failed to develop the potentialities of the territory. They had a different culture too. Part of that different culture was how or why they waged war. It was for religious reasons. It was for honor. It was for revenge. They were hunter-gatherers. And so they simply did not develop the land. Father Baden, who they did not develop the potentialities of their territory, of their land. Father Baden, who bought the land upon which sits the University of Notre Dame, remarked about this. He noted how the Potawatomis of this area, I believe there were Miamis too, he noticed that they simply were not farmers. And he tried to teach them farming. Schoolcraft, who was an American educator, observer of the Indian condition, and also worked with the Indians, noted, as did many others, that the Indians were barely at subsistence level. They had small families. They were rife with disease. There was no mining, little to no agriculture, barely enough food. And this was noted by many other people too. America brought order to this territory, to this land. And it was to respect the plan of divine providence, it was to, quote, share the riches of the world and its various parts with the peoples of the globe for the use of all men. And that is what we did when we occupied areas like Indiana and Illinois and other places. They were turned into farmland. They were made productive. Other places there was mining. Others there was building of various type. And so we were exercising this principle of providential destination as we did this. And we also exercised the title, the claim of civilizing the Indians. And I'll explain that in a little bit. So we dealt with the Indians for a very long time with treaties. They were broken by both sides. There was a horrific form of warfare practiced by both. And it was an existential struggle for many people. There is no doubt that there were excesses on both sides. However, I'm going to refer now to Alan Axelrod and his work, Chronicle of the Indian Wars from Colonial Times to Wounded Knee, where he writes, quote, contrary to the claims of some Indian as well as white activists, it was never the federal government's official policy to practice genocide against the native peoples of the West. Let me read that again. It was never the federal government's official policy to practice genocide against the native peoples of the West, though there was no shortage of individual racists and fanatics who advocated just that, end of quote. My own research concurs with that there was no government policy to practice genocide against the Indians. Like I said, treaties pretty much characterize how we dealt with the Indians for a long time. There was a conflict between the military and the civilians in the U.S. about how to treat the Indians. And President Ulysses S. Grant assumed the presidency in March of 1869, and he announced a program that shocked a lot of people. It was called Grant's Peace Policy. It was a number of executive orders. And according to Axelrod, it was, quote, conquest through kindness, end of quote. This included civilian oversight of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It included placing Indians on reservations where they could be, quote, educated, Christianized, and taught to become self-supporting farmers, end of quote. They're being civilized. They're being taught to be made productive. They're being civilized, which is one of the titles that are recognized by the natural law as justifying colonization. Military were not supposed to go on the reservations, but they could deal with Indians outside of the reservations. There were some rogue military actions they were dealt with. But the breaking point for this policy, which seemed to be working fairly well, was when a Modoc leader called Captain Jack murdered Brigadier General Canby on Good Friday in 1873. And this sent shockwaves through America because Canby was a Civil War hero. And it was just a cold-blooded murder because Canby was talking with Captain Jack and others about various issues, and he was murdered. Canby was an ambassador, if you will, and he was murdered. And that is a real crime against the natural law and the law of nations to murder an ambassador. So the policy ended, basically came to a bloody end by 1875. But again, there was no policy after that of extermination of the indigenous peoples. There's never been a U.S. government policy to exterminate the indigenous peoples. Prior to that, prior to President Grant, there was President James Monroe and President Andrew Jackson. Both of them sought the protection and the improvement of the Indians, at the same time allowing for the land, the territory, to be developed, to cooperate with God in creation, to advance this principle of providential destination. President James Monroe expressed explicitly his fear of the continued existence of the Indian people in January 1825. He said, if we don't do something, they might be wiped out, and we can't have that. This is President James Monroe in January 1825. This is very important. And Andrew Jackson said a similar thing later in 1829. They recognized that there were some practical problems even with the Indians because of the political situation in the states. And so they believed that the best way forward was for Americans and Indians to cut down on the fighting, to save the Indians, and to civilize the Indians, to develop the land. In accordance with providential destination, was to get the Indians away from the Americans and conduct a program of training or education of the Indians so that they could be more productive with crafts and agriculture, civilizing them. This involved relocations and the infusion of large amounts of capital, both human and financial, to retrain these people. So you had the Indian Removal Act of May 1830. Under the law, tribes willingly moved west. They'd be given land, annuities, and other financial and material aid. and they were given an area of sufficient size that the Americans could not encroach upon. This was the policy of the U.S. government: providential destination, civilization, very much in line with God's law, with the natural law, which is God's law. So I wondered, I did some research to find out were any tribes in the continental United States, in the United States, were any tribes genocided? Were they destroyed? Were they just wiped out? And I came across an article by Leslie V. Tischauer in Genocide called Genocide of American Indians from 2023. And she wrote about, I think there's about 12 tribes here, or 11, that have been completely exterminated. So I'm going to list the tribe, the region they inhabited, when they were exterminated, and who did it and how. So the first tribe she came up with was the Calusa tribe from Florida. They were exterminated between 1513 and 1530 by the Spanish in a war. Now the Spanish and the Portuguese were Catholics. They had the Catholic Confessional State, and they had Catholic monarchs. So we'll just say Catholic, Catholic, Catholic. And I bring this up because it's the Catholics who oftentimes talk about America being based on genocide, when actually it's the Catholics who committed genocide. Another tribe was the Massachusetts tribe in New England between 1617 and 1633. Well, that area was under the control of the British. And the Massachusetts tribe passed away because of smallpox, according to Tischauer. The British were Christians. They had a king who was head of the Church of England. And it was a theocracy, I guess you could say. It was I don't know, Church of England Confessional State. Okay, so it was a Christian confessional state at one time. And under them, the Massachusetts tribe was wiped out. Then came the Pequot tribe, New England, again, British, under British control, 1637 to 1638. English did it in a war. Wiped out the Pequots in a war. And then the Powhatan tribe in Virginia, between 1637 and 1705, was wiped out by the English in a war. Christian confessional state, England, Britain. Then, let's see, we get to the Narragansett in Rhode Island, which was under the English. Between 1675 and 1676, the English in a war wiped them out. Susquehannock tribe in New York, which was under the English, was a colony, between 1675 and 1763, they were wiped out from disease and war. Then the Chitimacha tribe in Louisiana between 1706 and 1717 were wiped out by the French in a war. Now, the French were also Catholics, Catholic Confessional State, and Catholic monarch. Catholic, Catholic, Catholic. And they exterminated through war the Chitimacha tribe in Louisiana. Another tribe that the French exterminated were the Natchez in Mississippi between 1716 and 1731. After that, we got the Chinook tribe, Columbia River region. It's English American, 1782, 1853, mostly Great Britain. I would say that was smallpox. And then the Yavapai tribe in Arizona between 1873 and 1905 died off because of tuberculosis. So you've got basically 10 out of 11 tribes that ceased to exist because of the Spanish, the French, the English, who were all confessional states of one type or another. Tischauer goes on to say that between 1492 and 1592, the population of indigenous people in Latin and South America dropped from 25 million to 1 million as a result of disease, war, starvation, atrocities. one sort or another. Okay, and then those are the Spanish and the Portuguese. They were Catholic, with Catholic Confessional State and Catholic monarchs. Catholic, Catholic, Catholic. So that's a 96% reduction of indigenous peoples. And I looked at that number. I did other research, and that looks that looks in the ballpark. Um, the Catholics didn't keep track of who died. That tells you a lot right there, or of how many died. Jeff Flynn Paul, in a March 7, 2023 talk called The Myth of the New World Genocide, said that about 8,000 Indians were killed in massacres in the United States out of about 2 to 10 million, he figures. 8,000. Compare that 8,000 with 24 million. So when people tell you, um, when people tell you that America was based on genocide, they're lying. They're telling you a lie. We were not based on genocide. We practiced two well recognized, well known natural law principles that go all the way back to School of Salamanca, if not before. And those two principles were providential destination and civilization of a backwards people. And our policy was never to commit genocide. Thank you.